My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm 72 years old. I was a registered nurse for 41 years in Dayton, Ohio. I buried my husband of 38 years. I raised one daughter by myself after he died. I've paid off a mortgage, survived cancer, and worked night shifts that left my feet swollen for days. I am not confused. I am not senile. I am not bitter. And until 6 months ago, I truly believed my daughter respected me. The night she looked across my own dining table and told me my life was worthless, something inside me changed forever. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I listened. And then I made a decision that would change both of our lives. What she didn't realize was this: I've spent my entire life quietly preparing for storms, and she had just become one. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation going. The restaurant was too fancy for a birthday dinner. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, casting prismatic light across white tablecloths. My daughter Bethany had chosen it, insisting we celebrate my 72nd birthday properly. Her husband Marcus sat beside her, checking his phone every few minutes. My grandson Noah, only 14, picked at his pasta without meeting anyone's eyes. I should have noticed the tension immediately, but I was too busy feeling grateful they'd made time for me at all. Bethany ordered the most expensive wine on the menu without asking what I wanted. She drained her first glass before the appetizers arrived, then poured herself another. Marcus kept clearing his throat like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. When our entrees came, Bethany pushed her plate away after 2 bites. "Mom," she said abruptly, interrupting a story I'd been telling Noah about his grandfather. "We need to talk about your situation." I set down my fork carefully, suddenly aware that this dinner wasn't about celebrating. "My situation?" I repeated. Bethany exchanged a look with Marcus that I couldn't quite read. "You're living alone in that huge house," she said, her voice taking on that patient tone people use with children or the elderly. "You're 72. You can't keep managing everything by yourself." I felt confusion flutter in my chest. I'd lived in that house for 40 years. I knew every creaking floorboard, every temperamental light switch. "I'm managing fine," I said quietly. "The house is paid off. I keep it clean. I still drive, That's not the point," Bethany interrupted, reaching for her wine again. Her hand trembled slightly. "You're getting older. Things happen. People fall. They forget things. We're worried about you." The words sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced them in a mirror. Noah finally looked up from his plate, his young face troubled. "Grandma's fine, Mom," he said softly. Bethany shot him a sharp look that made him sink back into silence. "You don't understand the full picture," she told him, then turned back to me. "Mom, your life is basically over. You're just sitting in that big house doing nothing. It's worthless." The word landed like a slap. The restaurant noise faded to a dull roar in my ears. I watched my daughter's mouth move, forming more words I couldn't quite process. Worthless. My 41 years of nursing, worthless. The way I'd held my husband's hand as cancer took him, worthless. The sacrifices I'd made to raise her alone, working double shifts so she could have dance lessons and summer camp, worthless. The room went absolutely silent at our table. Noah stared at his plate. Marcus didn't correct her. He just sat there, spineless and silent. I felt my chest cave in, that hollow sensation of something breaking that you can't quite name. But I didn't cry. I learned long ago not to cry in front of people who couldn't handle your pain. Instead, I looked my daughter directly in the eye and said calmly, "If my life is worthless, sweetheart, I'll make sure it stops taking up space in yours." Bethany laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the quiet. "Mom, don't be dramatic. I'm trying to help you." She thought I was bluffing. She thought I was just a sad old woman having an emotional moment that would blow over by dessert. She had no idea what she'd just unleashed. I picked up my fork and finished my dinner in silence while Bethany talked about real estate values and safety concerns. I nodded at appropriate moments, smiled when expected, and filed every single word away for later. When the check came, I insisted on paying. The next morning, Bethany showed up at my door unannounced. She was carrying a leather folder stuffed with glossy brochures. I'd barely finished my coffee. "I brought you some information," she said, pushing past me into the living room where I'd raised her, where her father had taught her to ride a bike in the hallway on rainy days. She spread the brochures across my coffee table like a real estate agent closing a sale. Sunset Meadows Assisted Living, Golden Years Retirement Community, Peaceful Pines Senior Care. All the names tried too hard to sound comforting. "These places are really nice, Mom," Bethany said, her voice taking on that forced brightness people use when they're trying to convince themselves as much as you. "It's safer. You'd have people around all the time. Meals prepared. Activities. And..." She paused, arranging her face into what she probably thought looked concerned. "We could rent your house. It would help us." Help us. Those two words crystallized everything. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw the desperation she was trying to hide behind designer sunglasses and forced smiles. Her clothes were expensive but slightly worn at the edges. Her handbag was last season style. Marcus had mentioned changing jobs 6 months ago, something about better opportunities, but I'd noticed they'd stopped talking about their vacation plans. "Help you how?" I asked quietly. Bethany waved her hand dismissively. Just financially. The housing market is crazy right now. Your place could rent for $3,000 a month easily. Maybe more. $3,000 a month. I did the math instantly. A skill 41 years of nursing had honed sharp. That was $36,000 a year. More than enough to cover a serious debt problem. That's when I realized this wasn't concern. This was calculation. I was being sold a solution to her problem, gift-wrapped as worry about my welfare. I told her I'd think about it, which was a lie. I'd already decided what I needed to do. I just needed time to do it right. But Bethany took my hesitation as weakness, as an opening to push harder. She began calling daily. At first, the pressure was subtle. Little comments about how hard it must be to manage the yard work, the cleaning, the bills. Then the words grew sharper, more pointed. "You can't manage alone forever, Mom. What if you fall and nobody finds you for days? Do you really want to be a burden on Noah when he's older?" Each call chipped away at my confidence like water eroding stone. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if maybe she was right. Maybe I was being stubborn and foolish. Maybe I should just accept my age gracefully and let her take care of things. Then one afternoon, she came over with Marcus while I was making tea in the kitchen. I heard them before I saw them. They thought I was upstairs. Their voices carried through the old house's thin walls. "Once we get the house, we can refinance everything," Bethany was saying, her tone urgent. "The equity alone would clear the credit cards and give us enough for the business loan." Marcus murmured something I couldn't make out. "She doesn't need this much space," Bethany continued. "And honestly, she's not going to live forever. We might as well make use of it now while it can actually help us. Get the house. Not help me. Not keep me safe. Get the house." I stood frozen in my kitchen, tea kettle whistling like a scream, and felt 38 years of widowhood solidify into something hard and cold in my chest. My husband had worked himself to death to pay off that house. We'd chosen every paint color together, planted every tree in the yard, and my daughter was discussing it like a liquidated asset. I walked into the living room with my tea tray, smiling pleasantly. They startled like teenagers caught sneaking out. "Oh, Mom," Bethany said, her face flushing. "We didn't know you were home." I'd lived there for 40 years, but apparently now I needed to announce my presence in my own house. "Just making tea," I said mildly. "Would you like some?" We sat in uncomfortable silence, them on the couch, me in my reading chair. Then Bethany pulled out papers from her enormous handbag, documents that looked official and intimidating. "I brought something for you to sign," she said, sliding them across the coffee table toward me. "Just temporary power of attorney. It'll make things easier if you need help managing anything." I picked up the papers, reaching for my reading glasses. Bethany watched me like a hawk watching a mouse. I read every single word. Every clause, every condition, every loophole. It wasn't temporary. It gave her complete control over my finances, my property, my medical decisions. Everything. The document was beautifully disguised as concern, wrapped in legal language designed to confuse elderly people who'd gotten tired and stopped paying attention. But I'd spent 41 years reading medical charts and consent forms, catching errors that could kill patients if overlooked. I knew how to read between lines. "This gives you control of everything," I said quietly. Bethany's smile didn't waver. "Only if you need help, Mom. It's just a safety measure. Marcus and I can take care of things if you get confused or sick." If. Such a small word carrying so much weight. I set the papers down carefully, folding my hands in my lap like a obedient old woman. "Let me think about it," I said. Bethany's jaw tightened with frustration, but she forced another smile. "Of course. Take your time." But her eyes said something different. They said she was running out of patience, running out of time, running out of options. I smiled back and told her I'd call her soon. That night, I sat at my late husband's desk, the same desk where he'd paid bills and planned our future before cancer stole him from me. I pulled out our old files, documents I hadn't touched in years, financial statements, investment records, property deeds. I wasn't just sitting around in my worthless old life. After my husband died 20 years ago, I'd been terrified and alone with a teenage daughter to raise. But I'd also been methodical. I'd taken every spare dollar from my nursing salary and invested it carefully, conservatively. Index funds, municipal bonds. Nothing flashy or risky. Just steady, boring growth over 2 decades. My worthless life had quietly built more than my daughter knew. Much more. I'd never told Bethany about the investments because my husband and I had always believed in letting our daughter make her own way, not waiting for an inheritance. We'd wanted her to be self-sufficient, strong, capable. Now I wondered if we'd failed somehow. The next morning, I made an appointment with an estate attorney I'd never met before, someone Bethany wouldn't know about. His name was Howard Chen, and he'd been recommended by another nurse I'd worked with years ago. His office was downtown in one of the newer buildings, all glass and modern art. I felt out of place in my sensible cardigan and comfortable shoes, but Howard greeted me warmly, like I was important instead of just old. I told him everything. The birthday dinner, the brochures, the overheard conversation, the power of attorney documents. He listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and studied me carefully. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "what do you want to happen here?" It was the first time in months anyone had asked me what I wanted. I thought about it carefully before answering. I want to protect myself, and I want my daughter to learn that people aren't assets to be managed. Howard helped me understand my options. We talked for 2 hours, going through scenarios and strategies. He explained trusts and estate planning, showing me how to protect what I'd built while still maintaining control of my own life. When I left his office, I had a plan. If Bethany thought I was helpless, I'd show her what helpless really looked like. I'd remove every advantage she was counting on, every safety net she'd planned to exploit. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Self-preservation. The next time Bethany called, I changed my approach. Instead of resisting her pressure, I gave in. Just a little. Just enough to make her think she was winning. "You know, sweetheart," I said carefully, "maybe you were right at dinner. Maybe I do need to start thinking about the future more seriously." I heard her sharp intake of breath, the quick recalibration in her voice as she switched from pressuring to praising. "Oh, Mom, I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this." Reasonable. As if recognizing my own obsolescence was the rational choice. "Why don't you come over this weekend?" I suggested. "We can look at those brochures together. Maybe talk about the house situation." "That's perfect," Bethany said, and I could hear the relief and triumph in her voice. She thought she'd won. She had no idea that I was 10 steps ahead, that every word I spoke was carefully chosen, that the helpless old woman she was expecting was a role I was playing now. Saturday came. Bethany arrived early, bringing Marcus and Noah. My grandson looked uncomfortable, like he knew something was wrong but couldn't name it. He hugged me tightly when they arrived, holding on longer than usual. "Love you, Grandma," he whispered. "Love you too, sweetheart," I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. Whatever happened between his mother and me, I wouldn't let it damage my relationship with him. We sat in my living room with the brochures spread out again. Bethany went through each facility enthusiastically, pointing out amenities like she was selling timeshares. Marcus nodded along, his contribution to the performance. I asked questions, pretended to be interested, let them think I was considering it seriously. Then I dropped my first bomb. You know, I said casually, if I'm going to move, I suppose I should sell the house rather than rent it. Bethany's face went pale. Sell it? Why would you sell it? Well, if I'm going into assisted living, I'll need funds for the monthly fees. They're quite expensive. Selling makes more sense than renting. I watched the calculations run behind her eyes. If I sold the house, she couldn't use it to solve her financial problems. The equity would be mine, not hers. She'd counted on controlling the rental income, probably planned to skim some off the top for management fees. But Mom, she said carefully, renting would give you steady income. Selling is so final. I smiled gently. I thought my life was basically over anyway. Final seems appropriate. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Noah's head snapped up, his young face stricken. Marcus actually flinched. Bethany's carefully constructed expression cracked around the edges. Mom, I didn't mean. Oh, I think you meant exactly what you said, I interrupted quietly. My life is worthless. I'm just sitting around doing nothing. Those were your exact words, weren't they? She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time in months, she had no practiced response ready. I think, I continued, standing up with my teacup, that selling the house is the right decision. In fact, I'm going to list it next week. I walked into the kitchen, leaving them sitting in stunned silence in my living room. When they finally left, Noah hugged me again at the door. Grandma, he said softly, you don't have to do anything you don't want to do. Smart boy. He'd always been perceptive, even as a child. I know, sweetheart, I assured him. I'm doing exactly what I want to do. And I was. Monday morning, I contacted a real estate agent. Not someone Bethany knew. Someone who came recommended from my attorney Howard. By Wednesday, the for sale sign was planted in my front yard like a flag of independence. I'd been careful about the listing. The agent and I had discussed strategy. We priced it slightly high, counting on the neighborhood's desirability to generate interest. But more importantly, I'd specified that the listing was exclusive, no family exceptions, no insider deals. Everything above board and public. When Bethany saw the sign, she called me screaming. Actually screaming, her voice shrill with panic. You can't do this without telling me. This is my childhood home. It's my house, I said calmly. I can do whatever I want with it. But we had plans. We were going to help you manage it. Help. That word again, stretched and twisted to mean something it wasn't. I don't need help, Bethany. I need to live my life on my own terms. She drove over immediately, storming into my house without knocking. Her face was blotchy with rage and tears. You're doing this to punish me, she accused. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a woman drowning. Desperate. Terrified. I'm doing this to protect myself, I said quietly. There's a difference. She sank onto my couch, all the fight draining out of her suddenly. Mom, you don't understand. We're in trouble. Real trouble. Finally, the truth. Tell me, I said. So she did. Marcus's new opportunity had been a failed business venture that cost them their savings. They'd taken out a second mortgage on their house to cover the losses. Credit cards were maxed. They were 3 months behind on payments. The bank was threatening foreclosure. They needed money desperately, and I was the only resource left. Why didn't you just tell me this? I asked. Why the manipulation? The power of attorney? The assisted living brochures? She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, mascara smearing. Because I was ashamed. And because I thought if you knew, you'd say no. She was probably right. Not because I didn't love her, but because enabling her wouldn't help her. It would just delay the inevitable crash. Bethany, I said gently, I can't save you from this. You could if you wanted to, she said bitterly. You're selling the house. You could give us the money. And then what? You'd spend it, the problems would come back, and you'd need more. I paused. I won't set myself on fire to keep you warm. The phrase was one my husband used to say. Boundaries weren't cruelty. They were survival. Bethany stood up, her face hardening. Fine. Then I guess I know where I stand. She left without saying goodbye. Noah texted me that night. Mom's really upset. Are you okay, Grandma? I replied, I'm okay, sweetheart. Sometimes love means saying no. 3 days later, my house sold. Not just sold. It sold above asking price to a young family with 2 children who cried when they walked through the door for the first time. The wife was pregnant with their third. They loved the backyard, the neighborhood, the way light came through the kitchen windows in the morning. Bethany didn't come to the closing. She sent a 2-word text, "Congratulations, Mom." The sarcasm was thick enough to choke on, but I'd already moved forward with my plans. I didn't move into assisted living like she'd wanted, like she'd tried to manipulate me into accepting. Instead, I'd found a charming cottage in a 55-plus community about 20 minutes from my old neighborhood. It had 2 bedrooms, a small garden, a woodworking studio in the converted garage, and a porch perfect for morning coffee. The community had activities if I wanted them, privacy if I didn't. It was exactly what I needed, independence with proximity to resources. When I sent Bethany my new address, she called me immediately. You didn't move into assisted living. No, I agreed. I moved into a home I chose. But why didn't you tell me? Because you would have tried to talk me out of it. You would have found reasons why I was wrong, why your plan was better. I paused. I'm done letting other people plan my life. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long. Finally, Bethany said quietly, "What happened to the money from the house?" This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment where everything I'd carefully constructed would become clear. Most of it, I said calmly, has been placed into a protected trust. A trust? For what? For Noah's future. And for my own security. I heard her sharp intake of breath. You put my inheritance into a trust? It was never your inheritance, Bethany. It was my house. My equity. My life. The words were gentle but firm. The trust ensures Noah's college is completely paid for, no matter what happens. The rest provides for my care if I need it someday. Whatever's left after I'm gone will be distributed according to the terms I've set. Which are? Her voice was hollow. That's between me and my attorney. I wasn't being cruel. I was being clear. She'd counted on my money to solve her problems, but I'd removed that option entirely. Not to punish her, but to save both of us. A week later, Bethany showed up at my new cottage. She looked smaller, somehow deflated. I invited her in, made tea, tried to find the daughter I'd raised somewhere in this desperate stranger. I'm drowning, she said finally, sitting at my small kitchen table. I know. The bank started foreclosure proceedings. I'm sorry. I meant it. Can you help us? She asked, her voice small and broken. This was the question I'd been preparing for. The one I'd rehearsed with Howard, making sure I had the strength to say what needed to be said. No, I told her. I can't bail you out. Can't or won't. Both. I reached across the table but didn't quite touch her hand. But I can offer you something else. She looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. Hope that I immediately had to extinguish. I'll pay directly for a financial advisor. Someone who can help you restructure your debt, create a realistic budget, maybe negotiate with creditors. Not your debt directly. Your education. Bethany's face went through a complicated series of emotions. Anger. Disappointment. And finally, reluctantly, understanding. She accepted. Not gracefully, but she accepted. Over the next months, I watched my daughter transform in ways I'd never expected. She met with the financial advisor weekly, learning things she should have known years ago. She and Marcus sold their luxury SUV and bought a practical sedan. They cut expenses ruthlessly, gave up the country club membership, started shopping at discount stores. They put their house on the market and found a smaller rental they could actually afford. For the first time in her adult life, Bethany was fixing her own mess instead of expecting someone else to solve it for her. It was painful to watch. She was humbled, embarrassed, forced to confront the consequences of her choices. But she was also growing stronger. One evening, months into her financial rehabilitation, She came to visit my cottage. No agenda. No paperwork. No demands. Just my daughter, looking tired and older, carrying a bakery box with my favorite lemon cookies. We sat on my porch and watched the sunset together in silence. Then she started crying. Not angry tears or manipulative tears. Real tears. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry I called your life worthless. I'm sorry I tried to control you. I'm sorry I was so scared of my own failures that I tried to make you small enough to fix mine." It was the first real apology I'd heard. Not, "I'm sorry you're upset," or "I'm sorry, but," just sorry. "I forgive you," I said, meaning it. "But things can't go back to how they were." "I know." She wiped her eyes. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About setting yourself on fire to keep me warm." She paused. "You were right. I was drowning, and I was trying to pull you down with me." We talked for hours that evening. Really talked. She told me about the shame she'd felt, the fear, the way desperation had twisted her thinking. I told her about feeling invisible, unvalued, reduced to a resource to be managed instead of a person to be loved. When she left, we hugged at the door. It wasn't perfect. We weren't fixed. But it was honest. A year later, Bethany's financial situation had stabilized. Not solved. She and Marcus still lived carefully, still budgeted every dollar, but stable. They'd found a rhythm that worked, learned to live within their means, stopped expecting rescue. And through it all, she never gained access to my assets. The trust remained protected. Noah's college funds stayed untouchable. My cottage was mine alone. One evening, we had dinner together at a small Italian restaurant. Her choice, her treat, though I knew the meal strained her budget. As we finished our dessert, she said softly, "Mom, I've been wanting to tell you something." I waited, spoon hovering over my tiramisu. "You were right. About everything. When I called your life worthless, you made a choice. You removed yourself from being useful to me financially. You gave me exactly what I asked for." She smiled, sad and wise. "You gave me a worthless resource, and it forced me to become resourceful myself." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Your life was never worthless, sweetheart. And neither was mine." She nodded, tears shimmering. "I know that now." For the first time in years, my life felt anything but worthless. I'd spent 41 years nursing others, 20 years mourning my husband, a lifetime being useful to everyone else. But that night at dinner, I realized I'd finally learned to be valuable to myself. Bethany had learned independence. I'd gained peace. And my grandson Noah? He'd learned that strength sometimes looks like saying no. That love doesn't mean sacrifice without boundaries. That a 73-year-old woman in a modest cottage could be more powerful than anyone expected. When Bethany called my life worthless, she thought she was stating a fact. Instead, she'd issued a challenge. And I'd answered it by building something new from what she'd tried to destroy. My life wasn't over. It was just beginning. Exactly what I'd asked for all along.